So we're going to move on to the next and final panel of the day. I hope you're still energized enough. I know it's been a long day, but a fascinating one. And part of the reason it's such a long day is it's so much to take in. But the last panel is obviously dear to our hearts, and it's focused on the role of civil society and individual shareholders in advancing sustainable and responsible investment in Europe. So I'm going to invite the chair up, Jonathan Hoare from ShareAction, and our panelists. And we're getting very close to drinks and dinner. And
that's challenging.
And a big thank you again to that to the last two presenters for some really good content.
Okay, I'm very conscious that we're over. I've got Frederica staring at me. Even though my eyes have dried out a bit, I can still see her. So thank you for letting me host this panel. We've got four speakers who are going to speak today. We've got Vicky Van Heck, who's the manager for sustainability at VBDO. We've got Niels Lemmers, who's director of European investors at Failure to Cut and Paste Properly. I'm sorry, it's completely disappeared. Everything's going horribly wrong. The European Investors Association and Legal Public Affairs Director of the Dutch Investors Association, the VEB. We've got Mick McAteer, who is the founder and director of the Financial Inclusion Centre, and amongst many other things is a trustee of ShareAction. And finally, but also first, we've got Vonda Brunsting, who is director of the Capital Stewardship Programme at the Service Employees International Union, which is US-based. Now, the way we're going to do this is Vonda's going to do a first intro presentation, about 10 minutes, to give us some lessons from capital markets campaigning in the US. And then we're going to go through the panel briefly, and then I'm going to try and talk as little as possible and throw it open to questions as much as possible from the audience before we wrap up. So I think the slide should be just about ready to go.
So I wear two hats at the trade union in the U.S. I am a trustee on our pension fund and also a member of an investment advisory council for another one of our pension funds, much smaller than those you've heard from today. It's the 1199 Healthcare Workers Fund, which is $10 billion. And then the SEIU Master Trust, which is $1 billion in assets. And we are there to protect the retirement savings of healthcare workers and janitors whose retirement is in those funds. I also direct a program at the SEIU, which is called Capital Stewardship, but it really works on behalf of our 2 million members in the same sectors, and really as their voice in the capital markets, but also with the over 100 pension trustees that are SEIU members who sit on a whole multitude of boards across the U.S. We have 3 members on the board of CalPERS. We have a member on the board of the Maine Retirement Fund, the City of Chicago, and et cetera. So those are my two hats. What I'd like to talk about today is the intersection of those two worlds. So when we look to do capital markets campaigns, when the interests of our members is aligned with the interests of our pension funds. And funny enough, that happens quite often because the capital markets don't always work for investors. And when we find those places where they're problematic and of deep interest to our members in terms of the role that they play in society, then we can launch different engagements. So the two examples are one in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is our Greece or Argentina. The economy is being forced off a cliff by the bondholders. They have $72 billion in debt. It is junk rated. The hedge funds have moved in, and the people of Puerto Rico are living in poverty. So I'll skip right to Puerto Rico. This is a sense of the debt. I won't really go through it. We don't have time. You can call me afterwards. And then the rate of poverty in Puerto Rico is, it's frightening. In Mississippi, which is well known in the U.S. to having the lowest poverty or the highest poverty rates, is still half of what is happening in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a territory of the U.S., doesn't have the same rights as the states do. And these are the funds that have now moved into Puerto Rico from the hedge fund universe and some mutual funds to buy up the debt of the island. Some of these same funds are also in Greece. And so we know from what they did in Greece, what they plan to do in Puerto Rico. And so they're going to extract profits by holding the government over a cliff, dangle them there, and insist on austerity. We're already seeing through their work in the U.S. legislature their strategy of lowering the minimum wage, annihilating the pension benefits, and then pulling out the taxes of the island, which will then have a devastating impact on any ability to rebuild the economy of Puerto Rico. So I think we're going to find a similar situation. We're already seeing what happened in Greece happening in Puerto Rico. We do not have the same strikes and so forth that we watched from the U.S. that happened in Europe. The members of the communities there are not mobilized to take action. And so we're doing that maybe by proxy with the Puerto Rican diaspora, which is in the United States, and largely in cities like New York, where I live, but also Chicago, Illinois, and also in California. So the connection then to our pension funds is this. We're investors in Puerto Rico. So those folks that are buying up this debt, they're doing it with some of our money. And what we've been doing for the last 6 months really is taking a harder look at the practice of the hedge funds and whether or not that's a really good investment for a long-term investor, which pension funds are. This report on the screen was put out recently by the American Federation of Teachers. The title says it all that glitters is not gold. And then the report from the New York Times that came out after the report simply says the pension funds were looted by the hedge funds. And the victims are the public employees who are counting on their pensions for a secure old age. And so this is a perfect alignment of the interests that we have. And then we partner with groups, or sometimes we don't partner with groups, but we simply each run our separate initiatives that are working collectively, really on the aggregate, to force pressure on both the U.S. government and legislators to do something in Puerto Rico. So this is just an example of that. There's a group called Hedge Clippers, and they came to a hedge fund conference at the Waldorf Astoria and took it over. It was exciting. I was there on the inside as an investor, and they came through the door, walked through the back of the room, and there were probably 500 people there, and formed a picket line and started chanting things like, "No more greed over people, stand up for Puerto Rico," and shut the conference down. So that was very exciting. So that's one example. My next example really goes to a completely different issue, and that is the lack of racial and ethnic and gender diversity in the capital markets. So I'm guessing that it's not different in Europe than it is in the United States. Maybe you have a better record than we do. But let's just say that the power structures of the white elite still run Wall Street. I think this is fascinating. Our economy in the U.S. was built on the slave trade. It started on Wall Street. This is where one of the markets was. This is a picture from that. And so we in the U.S. Have been confronted for the past 2 years, and probably longer, with videos and news reports and experiences in the streets of young black men being killed by police officers. And not just black men, but black women, minorities. And our membership in SEIU is over 60% women and people of color. So these are the people that live with us in our communities. They're the children of our members. And it has really led to a huge effort inside the union to address the issue. And so we have found in our capital markets work a complete alignment with trying to address structural racism in the financial markets. And so I've put together a program to try to work on that. So this is just, going from the slave trade hundreds of years ago to the current crisis in the housing market over the last couple of years. And just one statistic, and that minorities are 3 times more likely to have high interest mortgages than white applicants with the same credit score. So that sort of structural racism through the markets has really haunted people. The Great Depression that we experienced, the loss of livelihoods, of investments, of homes, of jobs, has a disproportionate impact on people of color. If you look at the capital markets, there's very few board members, the people who are running these companies in the US, that reflect the society as a whole. And this is just a slide that talks about Apple not having any black board members. Women, we're so far behind. Not as women in general, we're, I think, probably far ahead, but on corporate boards, we hold 16.9% of board seats, and women of color are 1/3 of all working women, but hold 3.1% of corporate board seats. This is just, again, another illustration of our dismal track record. This is the Fortune 500. And for us as investors, we actually think that by not addressing the lack of diversity on corporate boards, we're leaving money on the table, right? So that this is not just something that we feel like we need to do something about, but this is something that we have to do something about to protect our assets and our funds, because our performance actually is being harmed by the same old boards that have been there, the boys' clubs, as you wish, for decades. So there's a case to be made for the disparity. I won't go through all these, but this one, 15% of boards with gender diversity more likely to outperform, and 35% with ethnic diversity more likely to outperform. So this is something that we feel like we're in a great position to drive. We've developed a agenda around exactly what to do with it. We're going after corporate boards. We are looking at our own pension boards. Again, the labor movement in the US does not reflect our membership in terms of the leadership of our unions and the leadership of our pension boards. We're also putting policies in place to bring more diverse asset managers into the funds. And this then aligns up next to what you've probably been hearing about in terms of Black Lives Matter and the work that SEIU has taken on to foster that movement on the ground. And we think that we can do that in the boardroom. So finally, we believe that these issues are linked, not only climate risk, or climate justice, but racial justice and economic justice. We're not going to get there if we just take on the issue of climate. It's very tied to economics. We're seeing that right now with the scandal in Flint, Michigan over the poisoned water, but then also the work that we've done with companies like McDonald's, where you have a picture of this woman and her child on the screen, and she says, "I work for a $5.6 billion corporation. Why do I have a 2-week paycheck that's $90? So I'll leave it at that, and happy to answer questions later.
Thank you.
So I do have some lessons learned, which is what I was asked to do. Would
Go
you like?
for it.
But you want me to do that now, or do you want me to wait?
No, you can carry on for. You were given 10 minutes.
Oh, all right.
I think you've only used 9. So.
Okay. All right. So 4 lessons, really quick, which I think we've already heard about earlier today. One is that we focus on those issues of greatest concern to our members. So I don't know if people represent NGOs here with a broad membership base. I have for years wanted to work on climate in the union. Our members weren't there. We got there 2 weeks ago at our last convention, so I'm looking forward to that. But this issue is so important to us, and I think that putting your own personal interests aside to really focus on what your members care about will help you be successful. Second is, like we heard in the previous presentation, education is hugely important. We do deep analysis of the issues that we tackle. We do not go forward without talking to experts in the field, becoming experts, and then doing a lot of membership training, both of our members who are in the pension funds, who are leaders in the field and also our trustees. Timing is crucial. Again, on Puerto Rico, it's been there waiting to blow up for 2 years. We are finally getting some traction on it because the defaults are going to hit in July, a couple weeks from now. And then finally, I don't think we ever work alone. We always work in coalitions with other investors in particular. We're doing a number of these initiatives around diversity with all of the large US-based pension funds. In fact, yesterday, CalSTRS, the large teachers pension fund in California, just passed a new diversity policy that I think because of our work included not just gender diversity, but also racial and ethnic diversity. So those are my lessons learned, and I'll hand it over back to you.
Thank you very much. Now, I think if we advance the slides, then Niels, you should be next to do your... There we go.
Yeah. It's always nice to come after the investment hedge fund bashing, because I always need to clear my mind after that. Because yes, there are guys that have ethical lines, and they sometimes cross. The question is, where do you put the line, and where is the market failing, or where is the country failing? But I'm not there to defend them. I think you should invite them the next time and let them tell themselves why they betting against Argentina, Puerto Rico, and God knows whatever countries. My constituents mostly are individuals, just people who are working, save some money, and then try to do the right thing for a longer term. And if we ask the question to our members, which is 50,000 in the Netherlands, or roughly 2,000 individuals now in Europe, what is the most important thing for you when you go and start investing? Just a very open question. Well, last time we did that was 2015, and 75% of the people said return. Just return. That's why I'm starting. I want to have some more money when I'm done investing in something. The other 25, of course, was about a better life for my children, a better life for everybody, green energy, all sort of things. So the points today, I'm relatively new in this field of expertise on responsible investment. I was always on investment, because your investment has to be going concern, so it has to be responsible. Otherwise, there's no investment. There's no point of investing. But I learned today that that's not enough. So I've learned a lot of you. Thank you very much. Thank you, ShareAction, for inviting me. But my lessons learned are here on the slide, because we are campaigning mostly on the G, on governance, on remuneration, on strategy, on takeover and mergers. We are doing the work on the corporate scale. And if we start with a dialogue, we need to have a rationale, a business rationale. A company has to understand why we're coming as a shareholder. Why is this so important for the individual investor, which roughly is about between 8 and 12% only. The rest of the share capital is with institutional investors or hedge funds. So we are relatively small, but we have a voice. And that's what we are doing. We're giving those people a voice. We try to move the vote, to collect the vote, bring it on. But sometimes, and I'm feeling really sorry to say that, I disagree with David Watson, because he's a very bright guy, but he says you should try harder and not sell it. Yeah, well, the market is that you sometimes sell. It doesn't mean that you stop thinking about the issue. You don't stop thinking and having the dialogue with the company, but sometimes it's better to sell, because it's not going to change in your direction. The third thing, it's very important to campaign. It's very important, and I'm really struggle with your examples, because you need to campaign to do that. But where does NGOs mostly fail, and we did that as well, was claiming. If you achieve something, you have to claim it. You have to claim it very loudly. And I think Americans are better in that than the European ones. Maybe we think that everybody will see that we did a good thing. No, you have to tell it. You told everybody what needs to be changed, and then when it's changed, tell them. So I really like the last presentation about the coal divestment. I think that's good. And I think I'm going to do that myself in our conference later this year. Start claiming a little bit more. And why and why is timing so important? And why is this conference so right on the spot? Because there are challenging times coming up. I believe a couple of people today that says within 10 years there is no fossil fuel anymore. It's all something different. The Bloomberg report hints to a very specific issue, which is the risk and how to measure and how to disclose. It's just the same like the interest rate. A market can have a slightly dropping interest rates, it's no problem. But when it drops immediately with 10 basic points, it's a big problem. The same goes with the risk of environmental and climate change. If nobody changes until the last day before the cut will hurt. But if we do it gradually, I think we can all manage. But the shock in the financial markets could be huge if we don't do that.
Thank you very much. Now, Mick is going to be next. He doesn't have any slides, but he's promised to paint a picture with his eloquence. So, no pressure, Mick.
There you are. No pressure indeed. And I will try to be quick, because someone mentioned there was free drink afterwards. And I'm an Irish, speaking as an Irishman, I've really aligned my own incentives there, haven't I, to be quick. Anyway, so but what I want to say, sorry I don't have a presentation, but I really want to talk about two things, really. Using my experience as a consumer campaigner for about 25 years, but also as a former board member of the Financial Conduct Authority, which is obviously the biggest, is the regulator of the biggest financial market in the world, and as an advisor to the European Commission, to bring you some insight into what decision makers think and what actually makes them change their minds. Because unless you do that, unless you understand how decision makers think, then you won't actually achieve any real progress against your aims and your goals. Okay, so in my experience, there are four forces which change corporate behaviour, really. The first one is actually governments and regulators making good law and good regulation. That's the first one. The second force that sort of changes things really is when corporates themselves recognise the need to change, and this is the internal governance role, the improvement in ethics, the development of CSR policies. This is when they sort of autonomously and sort of recognise the need to change on their own initiative. That happens very rarely, by the way, but sometimes it does happen. Sometimes there are very progressive-minded corporates out there. The third force that changes corporate behaviour is whenever alternative provision emerges in markets. Now, that can be alternative forms of investment, whether that's through the Norwegian Sovereign Fund or whether long-term infrastructure funds or whatever, or the alternative provision of consumer credit to marginalised groups in America and in the UK. But it's when alternative provision emerges in markets that changes corporate behaviour as well. But I think then the fourth sort of major force emerges whenever civil society organisations learn how to harness market forces themselves. Now, what I mean by that, really, quite simply, is actually the actors that constitute market forces are the providers of capital, whether it's individual investors or institutional investors or whatever. It is the various financial intermediaries like credit rating agencies and market analysts. And then, of course, the third set of actors that constitute the market are the consumers of services as well. So I think that's the area really where campaign groups can really make a big difference. Because if you get that fourth area of campaigning right, if you can actually change market forces, then by definition you end up putting more pressure on the politicians and regulators who are very, very vulnerable to external pressures from media and from active consumer groups as well. Now, what I would say, that's all very well. That's all very easy for me to say. Sort of here are four forces which you have to change. Now, speaking as a trustee of ShareAction, I'm very well aware of this. But I think the challenge in this market, in the ESG market, is much harder than it is in the sort of the consumer market, or the consumer campaigning sector where I come from. And I think you guys, face a number of difficulties really in actually exerting force or exerting change in those four domains that I talked about. The first big challenge really, and probably the biggest challenge, is that financial markets are global. They are vast. They are fast. They are irrational, and they are ruthless. But unfortunately, the global political institutions that we have to make laws and rules, in contrast, are actually slow, very slow to respond. They're cumbersome. They're often divided. And as a result, they often end up settling for the lowest common denominator when it comes to standards. So that we do not have the set of global institutions that allow us to make policy at a global level, which is absolutely necessary to constrain and influence the behavior of global capital markets. So there's a real disconnect there between the operation and the scale of capital markets and the power and the ability of global institutions to constrain and influence those markets. I think also linked to that, the political systems where the biggest financial markets are located, and that just means really, in short, to be blunt about it, it means the US and it means the UK. The political jurisdictions there have a very short-termist mindset. We do not have long-term thinking in the UK, nor is there long-term thinking in in the US. This contrasts to the thinking we see in Norway and indeed to the long-term mindset we see in the Netherlands as well. But the two main political jurisdictions, as I say, which have the biggest capital markets and biggest financial markets, do not have a long-term political mindset. Again, that is at odds with the objectives of long-term environmental investment and sustainable investing. I think also the other difficulty for civil society really is to be fair, there are some very, very effective global civil society organizations, but they are spread very thin, and it means that their impact is very diffuse. That they don't have the same impact, for example, as some of the powerful consumer organizations you would see in the US or in the UK. I used to work for WICH, the Consumers Association, which is the biggest consumer group in Europe. We had over 1 million members. We could actually harness millions of hits on websites, hundreds of thousands of letters to MPs and to the Prime Minister at the time if we wanted to develop a hard-hitting, powerful campaign that couldn't be ignored. It is very, very difficult for campaign organizations to use those campaign techniques on a global basis because, again, the size of the financial markets and the size of the corporate lobbies mean it is very, very difficult for us to take them on. I think the other point, which is something I often have arguments with my civil society colleagues, is that I think there is a real place for protest, but I do think sometimes civil society organizations love the theater of protest far too much, and they ignore the importance of building evidence and sustaining campaigns. And the reason why that's important as well is very, very simple. In my time, I've noticed that big corporations have completely changed their strategy when it comes to dealing with civil society organizations and campaigning organizations. In the old days, if consumer groups or civil society groups had criticized a big corporate, the first reaction would have been to hire lobbyists, to have advertising campaigns, to go on the radio, go on television, to actually fight back and push back against the claims. The clever corporates no longer do that. They will come on the radio, they will come on the television, and they will say to the civil society organization, of course we agree with you. We share your goals. We want to work in partnership with you. And what happens then is that the politicians take a box, civil society organizations take a box, and they walk away thinking the battle has been won. We are very good at winning the propaganda war or the media war. We often lose the peace. Now, what that means then is that once the media caravan moves on and the media moves on to the next big scandal, the corporate lobbyists then get to work behind the scenes. Most of the damage done to initiatives is actually done in the corridors of power, whether that's within parliaments or within the buildings of the regulators themselves. So by the time an initiative starts in the political system and in the regulatory system and comes out the other end, it looks nothing like the original agreement. So again, we cannot forget that if you just win the media war or make a successful protest, that is only the beginning of the battle. It is not the end of the battle. The job is far from done. And any successful campaign has to be backed up by evidence and sustained campaigning in the corridors of power as well. Now, I think Just let me make a couple of more points, really. The other thing you really have to work against, you're fighting against in your areas, really, is around consumer psychology. Now, I mentioned really that, that to harness market forces, you've got to convince not just the providers of capital, but the consumers of services. Now, too often, certainly in my experience, is that, there still is a sort of short-term psychology or a short-term mindset amongst consumers of services, as well as a short-term mindset amongst investors and the stewards of capital as well. So, I mean, it is more difficult for you guys working in this field to convince ordinary consumers to actually make their voice heard for campaigns like this. It was actually quite easy for me as a consumer campaigner because I could point very easily to a short-term financial gain if we managed to persuade a consumer to sign up to one of our campaigns. It is just more difficult for you guys to persuade consumers and citizens to sign up to long-term campaigns where the reward might not be seen in their lifetime. It might only be seen in their children's lifetimes or indeed their grandchildren's lifetimes. So you face a more difficult communications battle as well. And I think just the one last point I would make again is that back to evidence here. I think one of the other biggest barriers, certainly to encouraging long-termism or long-term stewardship in the capital markets, is the existing system. The existing system is so inefficient. There are so many costs extracted from the financial markets at the moment that actually trying to persuade long-term investors and indeed pension funds to pay slightly more to have more information so they can exercise stewardship and long-term investing is a big ask. So I think, unless you actually clean out the existing system first, you will not create enough space to actually encourage people to pay more for the necessary information they need to actually make long-term investment decisions. So those are the barriers, I think, that sort of mitigate against the effectiveness of civil society organizations. However, on an optimistic note, I think there's real progress being made. I think more progress can be made, and that's why networks like this are so important. Because if you do work as a network, then what you do is that you're able to pool resources and pool energy. It means you have a bigger impact, and actually it allows campaigns to be sustained as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mick. Vicky, I'm just going to pass you this, and it's that button there to advance it. And you should.
Does it work? Great. Yes, there it is. I want to start off with that I'm proud. And that's because we heard quite some inspiring examples today of Dutch institutional investors being frontrunners on responsible investment. So that makes me proud to be Dutch. Of course, I'm also the first to admit that we still have a long way to go. And that's why I want to talk with you in a couple of minutes about how we support the development of those institutional investors and what it makes effective, actually, and how we bridge also the gap between investors and CSOs. To start with, we are a social investment forum in the Netherlands. Our mission is to make capital markets more sustainable. We have about 60 institutional investors and 600 individual members. And among those institutional investors are the large pension funds, insurance companies and banks, but also a really wide spread of CSOs. You see some logos there in the back. And that's one of our main challenges, to actually bring all the members together and align their interests. But also I think it's one of our main strengths that we have both sides represented among our members. So what is it that we do? We focus both on the demand side of capital and the supply side, so companies as well as investors. We have 3 core activities. One of them is visiting AGMs. So we go to the annual general meetings. We ask their questions to the boards of companies as well as investors to make their boards more aware of topics that are pressing at the moment. And we also ask for commitments, so to make commitment that we can ask for the next year when we come there. One of our second core activities is benchmarking. Already Sander mentioned the pension fund benchmark, which is ABP also is represented. We do it every year. And we also have benchmarks on specific themes. For example, the tax transparency benchmark. We started it 3 years ago, and then I remember people who were asking why tax? What does that have to do with corporate social responsibility? I think about 12% of the companies had a responsible tax policy. And this year, the why question is not even asked anymore, and about 80% of the companies has a responsible tax policy. So that's really an impact we see there. Thirdly, we also train investors on responsible investment. For example, later this year, we will train the boards of pension funds on specifics on responsible investment. So, yeah, what is it that makes these things effective? And also, how do we bridge that gap between investors and CSOs? I think there are several reasons for that. Firstly, knowledge sharing is an important topic. So we bring investors and CSOs together. Investors like to know about the issues that are present and therefore want to talk with CSOs. And the other way around, it can also be good to have an insight on the main challenges that investors face. Also, our approach, we call it constructive critical. So we're not running into an AGM and disturbing the whole meeting, but we're often give compliments to start with to investors and then ask about the next steps. And this helps us building a relationship with investors as well and to see that we understand what's going on and that they're doing an effort to improve. Understanding the business and for example, especially make it practical for investors as well. I think that's very important. Often they don't know what to do with an issue, and if you give them a few steps they should take and how to implement it, it makes this much easier for investors, and therefore also facilitates a dialogue between investors and CSOs. Our benchmarks also create a race to the top, so we focus mainly on frontrunners because those are willing to get into dialogue and take an extra step, and then laggards will usually follow, is in our experience. And I think altogether a mix of activities makes it really successful. So both asking questions at the ACMs, do benchmarking, do individual engagement, and that's how you convince them all together.
Great, well, thank you all very, very much. As I said, I'm just going to throw it straight open to the audience to ask questions. If there aren't any, then I have some. But I'm hoping that if the last sessions have been any guide, there'll be lots of hands going up. So any at all? No, I'm going to go first then. Oh, we got one. Okay, yeah, Sebastian from WWF.
A question to Vicky. You said you create the race to the top, focusing on front runners, assuming that laggards will follow up. And is it really always the case? I have the concern that some laggards will follow up and catch up, and some will not move at all for whatever reason. And that at some point, regulatory action is required in all cases to ensure there's a bottom level playing field. And then that will, create capacity, create space for innovation, for front runners to go even beyond. Would you agree with this or not? Thanks.
Yes, thank you for your question. I agree that there has to be a baseline on responsible investment for also the ones that are really at the bottom. So therefore, regulation is very important, I think. But in our experience, and also from research we done on engagement and when is engagement effective, you see that focusing on the front runners means that you can make a lot of more progress, and it doesn't mean automatically that laggards will follow, but it creates for them also space and opportunities to see, okay, we could do this as well, or we could take at least another step, and they see how it can be done. So that's the advantage, I think.
You go on.
Thanks very much, Hugh Whelan from Responsible Investor. Sorry to throw in another question, but I was really interested in what Mick said about alternative provision and the last point you made, when civil society can harness market forces. And I wonder if you had any thoughts in that direction in this age of disruption, because those 2 points strike me as very sort of in the air du temps, as they might say in France, disrupting the financial services industry, thinking about alternative provision. Have you seen any good stuff out there that people might coalesce around, to try and do those things?
Well, I mean, without being overly cynical, I mean, whenever I hear the word disruption, I never think of positive things. All I think of is my flight being delayed from London to Berlin. It's that's disruption to me. It's or transforming this and disrupting that. I think we've already heard some really good practices today. I mean, I'm a big fan of the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. Despite some of its drawbacks, it has made a big difference to the capital markets. It really, really has. There are other initiatives as well in Holland. We've seen some in America. The behaviour of some of the big pension funds in America could really teach the UK pension funds an awful lot. So there is some really good institutional practice out there. I think what I mean by alternative provision is that, I think that this gentleman made the point that, unless you have the right combination of incentives along with deterrence to deter bad behaviour, you're never going to create room for truly transformative business, because the laggards, the mass of the market will always drag the leaders back, or else they'll make sure they remain a marginal influence in markets. I think we just don't, it's very difficult to comprehend just how big the global financial markets are. They're huge. So anything that truly disrupts financial markets will have to be really, really powerful. But to create a level playing field, you also need good regulation as well to create a level playing field. So, there are good examples, but, there's a lot more to do.
No, I just wanted to add from the U.S. perspective, we've seen a lot of disruption the last 6 months or so, and I would see it as a positive thing. The number of people marching in the streets and, just I think both on issues around, as I mentioned, Black Lives Matter, but also the strikes around the fast food chains. People are really, you can't survive on, that's the slogan, $7.25. That's the minimum wage in the U.S. And the question for me, in my mind, is civil society ready to sort of partner with folks who are angry and want to do something? And are there institutions that can turn that and channel that into something that's positive, right? So we saw in the U.S., after the financial crisis, Occupy Wall Street, you just don't hear about it anymore. And there wasn't a sort of a functioning institution to sort of pick that up. Not that they didn't have an impact, but I think that what we need to have, and I think the labor movement provides one infrastructure and institutional support for people who are trying to improve their lives and get out of the sort of crippling inequality that we experience. But then are there other organizations in this room and out there who can then, be in a position to sort of lift up when those disruptions take place and channel into something that's very positive for the capital markets?
I think we're talking about two completely different things. I'm not disagreeing with you, by the way, at all. No. I think your question is about. If you read the financial pages, if you read sort of, think tank journals and whatever, all you hear these days is disruption. It's all about disruption. What they mean by disruption is sort of, guys coming into the market think they can actually make money by sort of labeling something disruptive and transformative. That's the problem. But what you're talking about is real disruption. That's about civil rights. What? Well, I would love to think so. I'm sorry. We will not. I've yet to see a so-called disruptive business model that is as transformative. Sorry, I'm using the language myself now, but as say for example, the journey, the change from the horse-drawn carriage to the combustion engine, that was transformation. That was disruption. And look what that's got us in the long run. But a lot of the stuff we're seeing is just simply a reordering of doing the same old financial services. I mean, we haven't even seen an Uberization of financial services. Never mind a real step change from horse and cart to technology. But your point about disruption. I mean, one of the things. I mean, you can tell from my accent that I come from. I grew up in Northern Ireland, where Catholics couldn't even vote. Now, that was an area where, I mean, we always grew up on the legend that the McBride principles and US pension funds played a big role in actually progressing civil rights in Northern Ireland. So that kind of disruption is the start of the kind of disruption I support, not these sort of trendy guys coming in with sort of disruptive financial services that's not going to make any real difference to the substance of financial markets.
Can I add something to that? Because we had the biggest financial crisis in 2007, 2008. And I was there. I was there on all the AGMs where people throw shoes at board members. I was there when people were crying and running to psychiatrists because they lost all the money of the families. And I'm still there. So I did something wrong. I'm totally aware of that. I'm still here. The same people who cried then are now applauding the same board directors. So in corporation, in the corporate world, it doesn't change. Everybody has his mouth full about crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is, in the complete world, not more than 30 billion or something. In a trillions capital market. So where are we talking about? We're not even talking about a drip. People are talking about fintech. Fintech? If there would be a real fintech movement, the banks wouldn't have that power in Brussels, as I encounter time and time again when I'm lobbying for more investor protection, when I'm lobbying for more consumer rights in the financial industry. Yeah, all these MEPs say to me, "You got a great cause, keep fighting for it," and there's nothing changed. Yes, we got a lot of more regulations, but that regulation is so difficult that even an expert as I am need my complete weekend to understand 4 sentences. So don't even think that disruption in 2007 and 2008 helped the individual investor or the financial consumer. It didn't. And yes, I would love to talk about disruption in the financial markets, and I would love to talk about disruption in the fuel, energy, whatever business, but it's not there yet. So maybe somebody in the audience will have a better idea. Oh, you guys got a better.
One more go, Hugh. One more.
The people who matter at asset management companies, the thing that exercises their mind the most at the moment is the potential for their business to be circumvented by technology. That is what they think about. The reason that they don't worry about it too much is that there's too much regulation, and a barrier to entry in this market is a good thing for many of those people.
Yeah.
That is the reality that I hear on the ground.
They protect themselves by difficult, complex regulation, and they have a sort of a flip-flop between the market and the regulators. So you worked in the market for 10 years, then you go to the regulator, you did a very good job creating a more complex structure, and then you go back to the market and say, hey, I'm the guy who understands everything, so I'm really gold.
I'll genuinely shut up in 2 seconds. But I think the clever thing sometimes is to, when you identify the big problem, is to try and think about how you can be clever to bring in potential solutions to the big problem. It's worth thinking about as an approach.
I'm going to change this subject now because there's one more question behind there. Mick has given us Mick's speech gave us reason to drink, and Hugh is now trying to start the barroom brawl. That can happen, and we can all watch. Sonia, you want to take that question there? I'm conscious we've had all men asking questions, so I'm going to take. Do we need to? I'm getting the signal from Frederica, so go on.
No.
Last one. Last one.
Thank you. All right, I'll keep it short. Activist investors, and I don't mean the type of activist like you, but I mean an activist investor like ICANN or Bill Ackman, or these big hedge funds who take a multi-billion-dollar stake in a company, try and get control of the board, or at least really influence it, and then make real change happen. Why if we believe what Carbon Tracker, for example, presents, and the stranded assets hypothesis, and the general idea that actually responsible or sustainable investment is actually better, you would expect to see some of these people now teaming up, perhaps with an NGO or an entity like Carbon Tracker, and saying, you know, we have a very different vision for this industry. It needs to be, capital needs to be returned to shareholders, maybe teaming up with the pension fund as well, and doing that type of level of activism. Why, back to your harnessing of market forces, why do you think we're not seeing that yet?
Can I just, I'm relatively new, as I said, so I can be a little bit blunt, and I'm Dutch, so I can be extremely blunt. Listening to all of you today here in the audience, there's not a clear voice. If Ikard Khan is coming into a company, there is a clear voice, there's a clear strategy, there's a clear purpose of doing that. If I go to the AGM of Shell or BP or Air France KLM, there are a lot of people talking about sustainability, but they're all saying something differently. So the board of directors can just lay back and say, okay, let's come it all over, and I'm going to partner with you. And then, you know, it all floods away. So if you want to campaign, and that was one I'm sorry, I'm going to turn back to what, but if you want to campaign, you have to campaign for a sort of a longer period, because boards of directors, they work with 4-year programs. So if you put up a shareholder resolution saying you have to change the strategy, and even if you get 51% of the votes, the board will say, very good resolution, we're going to think about that. And we're going to bring it back to you. And we're going to bring it back in 2020. Because that's the new moment of our new strategy, and then we will incorporate it. So, and what happens? Those guys who put forward the resolution and make all the fuss, they're not there yet the next year. And my organization, VB, is here for 91 years. And I have my recollection, not for my 91 years, but my books of 91 years of activism for the individual investor. And we were there, and then we were asking the questions. And VBDO is also asking questions year over and year over and year over. And luckily, APG in the Netherlands is also starting to ask questions repeatedly. Because if you want to change the system from the inside out, you have to be there. And you have to be there continuously and asking the same questions. And that's why I think the Norwegian guy and girl, I'm sorry to forget your names, but you did a very good job to put your foot down.
We're going to wrap it up there, but I want to say a couple of things. One is that we're here, Erin is here, the network has been formed, and we will be there. And we'll be there for 91 years. I hope it doesn't take that long. It's now my pleasure to introduce well, first of all, I'd like to do a quick thank you to the panel. And then I want to take some of Niels' advice, which is the claiming part. And I'm going to invite Camilla de Stecroix to come up to the stage, and Friederike Heinisch. And these two people have done more than anyone else in the room to make today happen. They've worked exceptionally hard, both to set up the network and to get the conference off the ground. So as they come up, I'd like you to give them a round of applause.
All right, so it's our task to wrap up the day, and I'm just going to give a little recap of the things that really stood out to me. There's been a lot of stuff to absorb over the day, so hopefully I can help you remember some of those things before we go and drink wine and chat and possibly forget. So throughout the day, I've been reminded of a moment 8 months ago when me and Federica sat in a meeting room at ShareAction with a blank piece of paper and were given the task of having to come up with a conference that would be a suitable launch for the Erin network, and we really didn't know how that was going to work. So I hope you'll all agree with me that it's been fantastic, and we've been so pleased by the number of people who have come, the quality of the speakers, and it's made me certainly feel a lot more optimistic about what we can achieve as a network in the future. I think the keynote speech today by David Pitt-Watson is something that a lot of people have felt quite inspired by, and I think it was really interesting to put into the historical context and the context of being here in Berlin how important it is things like who owns capital and what kind of economic model we have. And even though we've moved out of an era of those kind of questions spilling over into Cold War or Hot War, we still haven't solved the problem of workers owning capital rather than seeming like they're slaves to it. So we have a lot to do. And being a policy geek, I really enjoyed the first panel of the day and was very excited that Jeroen from the European Commission gave us an exclusive look at what happened in the consultation on long-term and sustainable investment. And that panel, I think, gave us a lot of optimism, particularly from Dionysia, and also hearing about all the great work that's being done in France with the 2-degree law that really shows like what can be done and a very high level of ambition, avoiding some of the pitfalls in the past of disclosure that's not really led anywhere. And I think the session from Xander also gave us a lot of hope. And I think over the last year, when Federica's been going around Europe, doing a great job of recruiting people who want to work together in Erin, one question that keeps coming up is, can you tell us what good looks like? If we're going to go and speak to a pension fund, if we're going to speak to an investor and we want to ask them to be more responsible, what should their policy look like? What can they do? And I think ABP really answered that question in a very thorough way. And it was really struck me that he didn't just talk about how they invest their money, but also about how they communicate with their savers. I think the after-lunch session slightly burst my optimistic bubble a little bit, and I think it really hit home how the panelists were saying that the 1.5 degree goal, that's pretty much already gone, and it's going to be a real battle to even stick to 2 degrees, and there's a lot of disagreement. The next panel was also similarly lighthearted. We talked about rape, the war in Ukraine, cancer, horrific Arctic oil spills. So it was got a bit depressing mid-afternoon, but I think we then picked it up again with the really, really inspiring talk from about the Norwegian oil fund. And I think both of those that session and the final panels have given us not only a really good reinforcement of the message of why civil society need to work together, but also shown us that there is a lot of expertise. There are a lot of NGOs out there who are doing incredible things, and we all need to learn from each other. We need to do our homework. We need to come prepared with evidence. We can't take it at face value when corporations or the finance industry say that they're going to change. We need to follow up on that and make sure that they stick to that. So I'm really looking forward to tomorrow, where we're going to dive into how exactly Erin can work together over the next year and do some more skill sharing. But before I pass over to Federica to say a few words about that, this conference really has been her work. So I wanted you all to give the loudest round of applause. And
to make me cry, but you won't. So congratulations, you made it this far. I see lots of tired faces. I hope that's evidence for some good input and content. Yeah, absolutely delighted with the full attendance we had, with a really rich and diverse input by our speakers and by some excellent and challenging questions by the audience. So big thanks to all of you for speaking, for coming, for participating. Really hope you made some new connections, learned something new, got some new terms to look up, something to take into your work, into your campaigning, and yeah, got some good new ideas. What's particularly exciting for me is to have quite a lot of Erin members launching this with us today. It's just a quick revisit. What is it? It's a network of civil society organizations that are keen to work on responsible investment, keen to work together, keen to improve their shareholder activism. And we have quite a diverse bunch, from global trade unions to organizations working with faith-based investors to really more activist types of organizations. Tomorrow is all about collaboration, which is a key feature of the network. Other key features of the networks will be skill and intelligence sharing. I think this whole area is still quite new for civil society organizations, so there's still lots of potential to learn more, to work more together. Another big element is and that will be, or is led brilliantly by Camilla, developing a strong joint civil society voice to be represented in Brussels. We've made some excellent progress on the IOPS directive. We'll soon know whether we got all the things we wanted to fight for. But yeah, we all know the finance lobby is pretty good at taking influence on EU policymakers, so we need to organize quite well to make our voices heard and make the most of the limited resources that we have. And then we are also very keen to launch some joint actions, cross-country campaigning, and that's what we're doing tomorrow, mapping ideas out. And anyway, consider Erin to be officially launched. Now give it a big post when you grab wine or apple juice, whatever. Thanks ever so much for coming.